So welcome, everybody. My name is Sophie Mitra. I'm a professor of economics at Fordham, and I would like to welcome you to the 2021 Fordham Distinguished Lecture in Economics. I would like to start by noting that we have enabled automated captions, so you should have captions at the bottom of your screens. The Fordham's Distinguished Lecture in Economics is now in its second year. This event is organized by the Climate Committee of the Economics Department at Fordham. The Climate Committee examines issues and develops resources to enhance diversity and inclusion in economics at Fordham. The committee includes faculty and students. The main purpose of this lecture is to expose students to a topic or a scholar that they might not typically study in their introductory courses in economics, such as basic micro or basic macro, and thus diversify sources and scholars that they are learning from. Now, turning to today's lecture, there will be two parts. We will start with a lecture by Professor Derek Hamilton, and it will be followed by a Q&A with the audience through the Q&A chat box. Feel free to start typing questions or comments for Dr. Hamilton during the talk. The Q&A will be moderated by Dr. Janice Barry. Dr. Barry is a labor economist with research interests in US and international labor markets and health policies. Her publications focus on gender, race, class differences in employment, wages, hours worked, and healthcare outcomes. In 2006, Dr. Barry was awarded a Fulbright Scholar Award to teach at Åbo Academy in Finland. Dr. Barry has a PhD in economics from the New School. The New School is the perfect transition to now introduce our distinguished lecturer today. We are honored and thrilled to have Dr. Derek Hamilton with us this afternoon. Dr. Hamilton was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He recently came back to New York in January to become the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. Dr. Hamilton is an internationally renowned economist working on racial disparities. Dr. Hamilton is a pioneer in the field of stratification economics, which derives insights from multiple disciplines to deepen our economic understanding of inequalities based on race, gender, and socioeconomic background. Dr. Hamilton is also a vocal proponent of specific policy solutions to racial disparities. He's received many prestigious awards, including the Inspiring Leaders in STEM Award, the Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship, and was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in health policy research. At a time of extreme polarization in the United States, his scholarship and policy proposals are more important than ever to help us understand how our economy can change to reduce inequalities through, and I quote, anti-racist policy regimes that neuter white supremacy and establish economic security for all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hamilton to Fordham.
Well, thank you, Sophie, for that generous introduction. Thank you to the Climate Committee at Fordham University for the invitation and platform to give this talk. I will say my remarks in maybe about 40 minutes or so, and I hope that leaves adequate amount of time for conversation at the end. So across the globe and throughout history, extreme inequality has persisted, and in plain sight, racism, sexism, and other forms of isms are strategically used to consolidate economic and political power for some at the expense of others. This is unjust, this is immoral, and it's all about power relationships. Understanding persistent and extreme inequality throughout history and the pivotal role that race and other group identities such as gender, disability status, sexual orientation, how they've all played in forging political alignments and economic divisions, it should be core to the mission of economists. It should be core to the mission of social scientists, and especially universities. Stratification economics is a theoretical and an empirical approach that challenges and expands the conventional orthodox economic view that's centered on human capital attainment as the explanation for inequality. It goes beyond individual optimization, infuses insights from multiple disciplines to examine identity formulation, collective group actions, especially as they relate to social hierarchy and economic outcomes and distribution. Given the scenario that was presented by Sophie in the beginning, the time has come for us to be bold, transformative, and to use our scholarly endeavors to take on the problems of inequality and stratification, not as issues, but take them on head on. A particular strength of university communities is its intellectual foundation. Shielded by the honors and privileges that come along with tenure, it is this intellectual foundation that provides us with a comparative advantage to conduct values-based, truth-seeking, rigorous research, however controversial it may be, with regards to permitting paths for economic mobility for all people. Personally, I'm not motivated to be a scholar solely based on a love of knowledge and knowledge creation, but my objective as an economist is to produce knowledge with the explicit intent of building economic inclusion, with the explicit intent of building civic engagement and social equity. Kind of what the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen has labeled building human capabilities, enabling people to define and attain their self-determined goal. And in this endeavor, we should recognize that one need not sacrifice rigor to study how institutions and behaviors intertwine with the objective of building inclusion. Likewise, we should recognize that all scholarship is rooted in norms. Although I expressed mine at the outset, all scholarship that claims to study production, transaction, and distribution is rooted in norm. The term political economist, unfortunately, has become an albatross, as if the field is somehow scientifically weaker and less objective than plain old economics. But again, one need not sacrifice rigor to understand these concepts. Likewise, one needs to recognize that all scholarship is rooted in norms. I believe we should follow the mantra of people like the Reverend Dr. William Barber, a co-leader of the Poor People's Campaign, where he has said economic justice is a moral imperative. We should embrace the principles of morality, decency, and economic sustainability in a vision and plan to address our commonalities of inequality in our political economy. These values are critical for defining economic good and promoting an authentic coalition of decency across race, gender, sexual orientation. Racism, sexism, and other isms, they're not simply irrational prejudice, but long leveraged strategic mechanisms for exploitation and extraction that have benefited some at the expense of others. This global pandemic has revealed a collective public health and economic vulnerability, but also a system that actively produces inequality. And in plain sight, we can see that race is a focal point. In a just world, one's race, one's gender, one's ethnicity, and one's nativity would have no transactional value as it relates to material outcomes. Yet the heaviest toll of this pandemic, well beyond class, falls upon vulnerable racial and gender identity groups, both across and within nation states. And the pandemic will only further expand upon these existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. We should recognize that the biggest pre-existing condition of them all is wealth itself. Also, many Americans, Black and brown families in particular, they have low wealth, they have inadequate health care, and they work in precarious but essential jobs that have fewer workplace protections, lower wages, and lower benefits. We know that wealthier families are better positioned to withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies, including a global pandemic. We know that racially disparate treatment by law enforcement, as well as our health and economic exposure to a pandemic, linked to a larger political and economic vulnerability for Black Americans, as well as Latinx, Indigenous, and other people of color, whether we're in a pandemic or not. The immoral devaluation of Black lives has been ingrained into the American psyche and is long overdue for reckoning. We need a deeper understanding of how this devaluing of individuals based on these identities relate to political notions of who is deserving and who is not deserving. This is essential if we want to expand knowledge beyond the conception of individual transactions into workings of our larger political economy and the structures that affect all of us. The structures of our political economy and race are well beyond class and individual bigotry. As a matter of course, these identities are strategically used to generate hierarchy and propel our systems of stratification. Despair and inequality are dramatic, and changes on the margins, they're not going to cut it. To reverse these decades and generations of poverty, discrimination, and economic and political concentration at the top, we ultimately need a bold overhaul of our laws and our economy. We need to recognize that we don't have adequate social safety net and mobility in place. What we have is over 5 decades of deregulation and a market revolution that has been supported by a neoliberal vision of supply-side economics, the lure that structures and government subsidies that benefit corporate interests, the so-called job creators, would generate a market dynastism of economic activity that's going to lift up all our boats. But this promise trickle down from this neoliberal supply-side vision has never come to fruition. The last half century of US policy has exacerbated the precarity that we have and generated structures where essentially all of the nation's productivity gains have gone to the elite and upper middle class, while effectively flatlining real worker wages for everyone else. This has resulted in an obscene and undemocratic, dysfunctional concentration of both wealth and power, especially by one's race, that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age. Basically, today we have the top 1/10% of earners, those earning above $1.5 million a year. They own as much of our nation's wealth than in comparison to the bottom 90% of earners, while the bottom 50% of earners own about 1% of our nation's worth. And this is before the pandemic, so I'm sure it's worse. Again, this obscene concentration, along with its plutocracy, we haven't seen since the Great Depression, and we should recognize that it's not natural, nor does it have to be our destiny. But at issue has been government complicity in generating and facilitating this extreme economic and racial inequality. We need a profound change towards a more sustainable moral economy with interventions that facilitate assets, economic security, engagement, human dignity, and social mobility for all people. Realized or not, the civil and political aspects of human rights, they are ingrained in our public psyche. However, at least as important are economic rights. The right to assembly, the right to speech, the right to choice in general. It is limited for individuals who lack basic needs like a job, adequate income, shelter, food, or healthcare. We need a new industrial policy that centers workers both domestically and abroad, coupled with explicitly anti-racist and anti-sexist economic rights. This would promote a fairer economy grounded in our shared prosperity. And why do I say anti-racist? Well, we have a history. In response to the Gilded Age that preceded the Great Depression, the New Deal reined in unfettered capitalism and corporate consolidation and provided a balance of power for labor and capital that set a foundation for a strong labor movement. However, it was not coincidental that by both design and implementation, Black people and Black institutions were largely frozen out. The passage of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, it guaranteed Americans the right to organize and bargain collectively, and it served as a critical safeguard for workers against exploitive corporate practices. But because of the Faustian bargain, to convince legislators in an apartheid-like Southern Jim Crow states to come aboard, the Wagner Act, by design, did not by accident, excluded domestic and agricultural workers who in the 1930s, 90% of Black women who were working were employed as a domestic or agricultural worker, while over half of Black men were in those fields. Still, although it's never been extended to Black people, I want to point out the concept of economic rights. It's not new, nor is it radical. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his 1944 State of the Union address, he called for an economic Bill of Rights. He said, we, quote, need physical security, economic security, social security, and moral security. Roosevelt knew that full citizenship demanded more than political rights. It required economic rights. The first article of Roosevelt's proposed second Bill of Rights, it was the right to employment. This concept of economic rights is also well grounded in our civil rights history. For example, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the Poor People's Campaign, they called for the government to provide economic rights in 5 ways. One was a meaningful job at a living wage. Second, a secure and adequate income for all, access to land, access to capital, and the ability to truly play a significant role in government, basically civic engagement. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, quote, I am not convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now and widely discussed measure, guaranteed income. However, our contemporary political economy, in my view, radically situates the market as a great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. Under this current ideology, government interventions to promote social mobility, they're deemed inefficient and counterproductive. Public provisioning to help the working class, they're purported to distort or worse, incentivize unproductive behaviors that would deter people from productive market-like behaviors. Race, along with government social programs, they're used as scapegoats to fuel this neoliberal agenda. Poverty and inequality, we attribute them to deficiencies internal to the poor and Blacks themselves. We stigmatize people based on race and an anti-Blackness frame in a strategic way for political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Basically, Blacks have become the symbolism of undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, super predators by which we can define a surplus population. So rather than empowering the poor, we manage them. We manage them as surplus populations. We do income maintenance rather than income mobility. We socially isolate them or segregate them. We conscript them to our military. We incarcerate them en masse. And we have policies aimed at controlling their reproduction, their fertility, and their family formation. We characterize them as persistently unemployed and unemployable. We characterize them as a source of crime, malice, and whose subsistence needs we deem a drain on our fiscal budgets. That has fueled the rationale for austerity. If behavior modification, particularly with regards to personal and human capital investments, if that is the central issue, Why should we fund government agencies and programs which at best misallocate resources to these irresponsible individuals and at worst create further dependencies that will fuel this irresponsible behavior? In this system, labor exploitation and political and economic consolidation in this system, freedom and choice are weaponized. They're used as rhetorical devices intended to appeal to one's desire to have agency in their lives and not be victims. It feeds into a proverbial American narrative where hard work, individual efforts are able to turn our proverbial rags into riches. And we offer individual anecdotes as evidence of the power of what effort in the free market can achieve. But what we don't offer in this neoliberal paradigm is systematic evidence of the countless cases of hardworking individuals who are not able to attain social mobility. And likewise, the anecdotes of individuals born into privilege who maintain that privilege regardless of any effort extended. Basically, these presumptions that I'm talking about, they pay little attention to the roles of power and how capital, initial endowment, can be used to adjust and alter rules and structures of transactions. Basically, markets are not immune to power, not immune to capital, in order to privilege that power and capital in the first place. Without capital and power, we lock in inequality. We've used words like choice and freedom to describe the benefits of market, but choice is an illusion if an individual doesn't have basic needs and power. It is literally wealth that gives us choice, freedom, and optionality. Economic freedom and authentic agency, they're rooted in resources, not just economic resources, political resources. And power and capital are self-reinforcing without government interventions. They will do what they do best. They will consolidate, they will iterate, and they will exclude some. In our economy, wealth and capital are used to capture social, economic, and political power and enable those who inherit this power the ability to change the rules and rig the system in order to favor their power and wealth in the first place. If we look back at history and think about the racial dimension of this, it's critical to note that a white asset-based middle class never simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy, and to a large extent, entitlements, literally government giveaways that provided whites with finance, education, land, infrastructure in order to accumulate and pass down wealth. However, that's in and of itself not a bad thing. What is problematic is that it provided it for some and excluded others. Our unjust racial wealth gap is itself an implicit measure of our racist past, rooted in a history in which whites have been privileged by this government complicit political and economic interventions, in contrast to a history in which Black people, as well as Indigenous people, their personhood and whatever capital and resources they may have been able to establish have been vulnerable to exploitation and extrapolation of state-facilitated or complicit confiscation, destruction, terror, fraud, theft, and other acts of violence. It's noteworthy that we're coming up this year on the anniversary of what had once been considered Black Wall Street, the Tulsa Massacre. This provides one of many examples of what it is I'm talking about. So as a result, today, Blacks as a group have very little ownership in America's land or means of production and remain in fear of violence, incarceration, and literally bondage. The history of this disenfranchisement from full economic participation is well documented. Policies like redlining, highway construction, exclusionary zoning, they've all worked in tandem with restrictive covenants, regulatory control to marginalize Black Americans and constrain their economic participation and political power. Today, we're still talking about voting rights. Yet much of the framing around the racial wealth gap, including the use of alternative financial service products, focuses on poor financial choices and decision-making on the part of largely Black, Latino, and poor borrowers. The framing is often tied and derived from a culture of poverty thesis in which Blacks are presumed to have a low value for and desire for education. The framing is wrong. The directional emphasis is wrong. It's more likely that meager economic circumstance, not poor decision-making or deficient knowledge, that those meager economic circumstances constrain choice itself and leave poor borrowers with little to no other financial options but to obtain and use predatory and abusive financial services. Financial behavior and literacy, they are practically useless for households with no finances to manage in the first place. In terms of debt, what we traditionally conceive of as good and bad debt, it has different implications once we consider race and that framework of targeting unprivileged racial groups with inferior housing and educational products, predatory finance, as well as ongoing housing and lending and labor market discrimination. They limit the choice set and rates of return on home ownership and a college degree based on one's race and ethnicity. And when we look at student debt, it's noteworthy that on average, the typical Black college graduate 4 years after graduation leaves with about $53,000 in debt. That contrasts with still too high, a 4-year average for white students around $30,000. And despite the misperception that Blacks don't value education, Black college graduates are in fact overrepresented in graduate education relative to their share in the population. They very well may be pursuing a resume building strategy, knowing that they're going to face discrimination in their life. Black students tend to take out more debt at every level of higher education and are more likely than their white peers to drop out of university because of financial concerns, largely because of comparatively lower household financial levels from which Black families begin with. And of course, that's grounded in our racial wealth gap that I've been describing as well. Yet and still, high achieving Black Americans, as measured by education, still exhibit large economic and health disparities relative to their white peers. The fact that Blacks who live in families where the head graduated from college, they typically have less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school, that's a property right in whiteness. The fact that a Black expectant mother with a college degree has a greater likelihood of an infant death than a white expectant mother who dropped out of high school, as well as the fact that a Black man with a college degree is 3 times more likely to die from a stroke than a white man who dropped out of high school. These are all examples of property rights and whiteness. The persistent pattern of worsening racial disparity with education, it's not limited to infant mortality and stroke, but it's also evident in most other major disease types, including cancer, heart disease, and HIV-related causes. Yet, for the most part, our literature in health and economics focuses both implicitly and explicitly on lower socioeconomic status of Blacks and the perceived confluence with detrimental behaviors associated with this class dynamic as the explanation for racial health disparities. Even the literature that examines racial discrimination as a determinant is largely geared towards framing it in low SES Blacks who are discriminated against. In essence, few studies examine that paradox that I've been describing, that even with higher levels of education and socioeconomic status, disparities persist or worsen. The emerging consensus is that the social determinants of health, which is the World Health Organization defines as the conditions in which individuals are born, grow, live, work, and age, that they're the primary determinants of health, and likewise health disparities. Then we end up with the presumption that if only a greater share of Black people and Latinx people invested more in a good education, that in turn would result in better jobs, higher incomes, and health disparities would dramatically reduce or be eliminated altogether. But again, education is indeed associated with better health and economic outcomes for all Americans, but racial disparities in health, labor markets, financial markets, they persist and even worsen at higher levels of education. In general, Black men and women between the ages of 25 and 64, they have about a 50% higher mortality than their white counterparts. But what's even more disheartening is that these disparities increase with education. Black men and women with a college degree are nearly 70% more likely to die than comparable white individuals with similar education. It may be the case that these low socioeconomic status Blacks face higher levels of stress than their higher socioeconomic Black peers, but still, as socioeconomic status rises, the relative stress required to cope with the efforts faced by high-achieving Blacks relative to their white high-achieving peers may manifest. This is related to a theory of prejudice of relative positioning described by the classical sociologist Herbert Blumer, a phenomena that's also described in the economic stratification literature. It argues that as socioeconomic status rises, so does the relative degree of race-related competition for high status and high reward positions. Let's go back to the Nobel laureate economist Sir Arthur Lewis, and in his book, Racial Conflict and Economic Development, he describes how dominant groups maintain their social hierarchical position by rendering subaltern groups non-competing. The theory explains that in the pre-market stage, when individuals acquire the skills, credentials in order to compete in the market, the dominant group intends to use their power to limit the subaltern group's access to the skills and credentials so as to ultimately render them non-competing in the market stage. Basically, limit the quality and quantity of education as an example. But Lewis goes on. He describes that a second strategy used by the dominant group, when members from the subaltern group are able to overcome pre-market barriers and become competitive, they basically change the credential criteria at the market stage so as to favor their own attributes. Or the second option is to simply discriminate against the competing members from a subaltern group. In other words, discrimination becomes more relevant the more high stakes it is and the more competitive members from the subaltern groups become. So education matters within group, but since social structures do not permit Black people to convert their education into desired outcomes at the same rate as whites, they're not protected by social class status as measured by education in the same way that whites are. Racial differences in key outcomes cannot be fully explained by a clustering amongst the less skilled. Unsurprisingly, within group, more education is associated with better outcomes. However, the tragic irony is that across group, Black workers with a college degree are most harmed relative to similarly qualified white workers as it relates to differences in desired outcomes. And this more harm becomes amplified during recessions. In essence, education is not the magic antidote for the enormous racial disparities that have resulted from state complicit laws, policies, and economic arrangements. I do not intend to diminish the value of education. There's clear intrinsic value, along with a public responsibility to expose everyone with a high quality education, with teachers trained to deliver that education in order for people to synthesize and fuse information into big ideas. But it is a myth that Black families don't value education, and also problematic is our overemphasis on the economic returns to education as the panacea to address our socially established structural barriers. We overstate the functional role of education to the detriment of understanding the functional role of wealth. Wealth as an outcome is enough reason to invest in it. Indeed, I wonder if our overemphasis of education to promote economic opportunity Is that a political ruse? In other words, is the rhetorical aspiration of equal opportunity a tactic to facilitate the hoarding of resources for the elite and the upper middle class? Basically, if framing inequality as an opportunity gap, does that serve the purpose of reinforcing market norms that put the onus of inequality on the individual while absolving the state from public responsibility? We should recognize that there are physical and psychological costs as well associated with stigma and exerting individual agency. So when we ask the question for people, or we direct people to work twice as hard and overcome their barriers, we should also ask the question, at what cost? Does the added effort and stigma imposed on high-achieving Blacks that threaten the relative position of dominant white groups, does that translate into deleterious health and economic conditions for them? That bootstrap narrative framed in a politics of personal responsibility, emphasizing individual agency, that might literally be bad for Black people's health. A similar argument can be made against people that are grounded in a class reductionist trope, that trope that treats race as an issue bound simply to how Black people are sorted along skills and resource distribution without knowledge and without accounting for discrimination. What we need to do as economists is a better job in understanding the roles of power and capital in our political economy, and be more focused on understanding and advocating for structures that truly lead to equitable and fair distributions. We're not atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by free will into fair and efficient allocation. Our conventional views of race prejudice as basically taste-based or ignorance that should be arbitraged away by non-bigoted profit-seeking firms is counterproductive. It ignores the strategic agency and benefits that individuals have in choosing and investing in their identity in a collective way, and how social structures may increase or decrease both the value and the incentives to invest in that identity. We need to do a better job of understanding power in the choice of investments in those identities. But here's the key part of my talk. The trade-off that forges political alignments between capital and political classes in order to facilitate consolidation at the top. We need to ask who benefits from racial stratification. We need to fully understand how a status quo of iterative cycle of both concentrated economic and political power, how that's able to persist in a democracy for so long. We need to embrace a third pillar if we want to understand that relationship, and that is race, or the existence of some permanent underclass marked by a subaltern identity by which a dominant identity group is able to maintain a status quo by sacrificing their vertical position in exchange for horizontal or relative positioning. In essence, we need a deeper understanding how devaluing or othering individuals based on social identities like race relate to political notions of deserving and undeserving. That's essential for us to expand our conceptions. The structures of our political economy and race go well beyond individual bigotry as a matter of course. In other words, here's what I'm trying to say. As America becomes more unequal, the despotic lure for relative status, the despotic lure of being able to say, at least I'm not Mexican, or at least I'm not Black, sadly has more saliency. We also need to move beyond class reductionism and recognize that race and other identities are pillars alongside political and economic power. There are intermediate economic and psychological benefits associated with distancing from some outgroup. In the American case, that would be Black Americans, towards some in-group. In the American case, that would be whites, and adopt that in-group white American identity. All this fits into the frame of Herbert Blummer's thesis of race prejudice existing basically as a sense of group position rather than a set of feelings where one members of the group have towards another member of the group. This impetus for psychological and material benefits that we call white privilege or the property rights and privilege is grounded in relative positioning. But we also need to recognize that this privilege is immoral. The notions of benefits that largely are predicated in self-interested norms, tribal norms of accumulation with no bounds. We need an authentic racial coalition to address our growing inequality, and it's going to necessitate that the white dominant group give up the benefits of white privilege. But of course, that's not an easy ask. It would be naive to think it's an easy ask. To achieve racial justice, we need an honest and sobering confession of the historical sins of slavery, a point in which American history, Blacks were literally capital assets for a white landowning plantation class. But not just slavery, sharecropping, white capping, Jim Crow, and the exclusion of Blacks from New Deal and post-war policies that built that asset-based middle class. We need this in order to have an authentic counter to the neoliberal frame that has caricatured Black, brown, and poor people as being deficient and undeserving. This will pave the way for new narratives that more accurately ground inequality in what it's grounded in, and that's resource deprivation. However, that acknowledgement alone would be empty if not accompanied by some material redress. Reparations provides a retrospective, direct, and parsimonious approach to address our Black-white racial wealth gap. But reparations alone wouldn't be enough. A seed capital program like baby bonds is economically and racially just, and it's a prospective approach that complements something like reparations. And it's prospective because it targets the domain of an outcome in perpetuity, in which across race there's very little overlaps. Whites and Blacks have very little wealth that are in common. Because it targets wealth, it would provide in perpetuity a policy that will trend us towards a just and egalitarian distribution of both capital and wealth. But what's more, what we need is a bold, transformative, anti-racist, and anti-sexist policy that by design and implementation include all individuals. We need to recognize that there's a set of enabling goods and services that are so critical for individual life, liberty, and self-determination that their quantity, quality, and access to them should not be vulnerable to pricing and rationing that come about from firms meeting their profit-maximizing fiduciary responsibility. Government has a different fiduciary responsibility. We need policies with public options that directly compete with and crowd out private options that don't ensure access to healthcare, housing, schooling, financial services, capital, and free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm at the hands of a state-sanctioned terror based on one's identity. For instance, by mandating an economic right to health insurance, society would effectively remove the burden and stigma associated with finance when we're most desperate, which is the point of delivery of that medical care. Whereas cost and profit considerations drive private insurers to ration quantity and quality, such concerns would be recognized and met long before the point in which we're most vulnerable when we actually need that health coverage. We should be looking to initiate economic rights to a productive and quality job, economic security that comes along with a living wage, as well as worker amenities so that we're not vulnerable when faced with a pandemic, and investments in things that are going to improve our public, physical, and human infrastructure. I'm not talking about an employer of last resort, but a viable alternative to undesirable low pay, low benefits, and poor working conditions, jobs that would address our 21st century physical and human infrastructure needs, including universal care work, including a Green New Deal to make us less vulnerable to the next natural disaster or unnatural climate change that we may face. This would dismantle the material consequences and social stigma associated with identity grouping by making this a right for all people. To be clear, I'm not talking about the end of identity or affinity groupings, but rather the end of its importance as it relates to material outcomes. Our current economic systems are founded on the values of self-interested accumulations without bounds of greed or without bounds of exploitation. But our economy should be grounded in different values, values of economic inclusion, civic engagement, human dignity, and shared prosperity. The good news is that change may be happening. We've witnessed across all 50 states and the entire globe, people shouting with solidarity that Black Lives Matter. Are younger generations and social movements beginning to redefine economic goods to embrace principles of morality, common humanity, and sustainability? These values, again, are necessary ingredients. The answer to the question, I don't know. But alas, what I do know is that without potent policy alternatives grounded in economic justice that neuter racist regimes and provide pathways of economic security and self-determination, white supremacy and the despotic political appeal for divisive leadership will always remain because of these notions of relative positioning. So I encourage us in conclusion to commit to justice, commit to it as a matter of faith, just as our economic discipline seems to have committed to our two welfare economic theorems, which has resulted in a dogma that puts a primacy on markets for fair and efficient distribution. In our commitment for justice, timeliness should not constrain us. We should be undeterred by what people think is possible or not possible by here and now and commit to our shared prosperity. We should recognize that in the end, it is our government, it is our monetary system, and it is ultimately our economy. Thank you.
Hello.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Hamilton, for that inspiring lecture. I'm going to start off the questions, if I might, and start with Thomas Piketty's work, Capital in the 21st Century, discussed the role of wealth in determining the chances and growing worldwide problem of structural inequality, locked in at birth as a result of laws, policies, institutions, and economic arrangements. In discussing the racial wealth disparity, would you comment on the process by which inheritance or bequests or other transfers are largely responsible for most of the racial wealth gap? And then secondarily, since you mentioned it, I was wondering if you could give a bit more detail on the proposed solution of baby bonds to address the racial wealth gap.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you for that question. I think the question is the point. We talk about social mobility and fairness based on individual efforts, based on ingenuity, based on attitudes. But the biggest ingredient for wealth is wealth itself. And the source of racial disparity as it relates to wealth is inherited. If we were to take somebody from Mars and drop them down today and see the disparities that exist today without knowledge of history, the conclusions they would reach would probably be something like, what's wrong with these people that are not doing as well? Why are they the paupers and these people not the paupers? They would likely come to some deficient standing or explanation of that other group. But if you have a historical notion, if you know the trauma, if the economic and physical trauma that's been perpetrated on a population for such a long time, then you would either be dishonest or naive to come to a different conclusion that power and capital are the sources of this explanation. So, to me, that the answer lies in the question itself. We know, and if we look at empirical evidence, counter to popular belief, when you control for income, if anything, I have seen no economic credible study that's demonstrated white people having a higher saving rates than Black people. If anything, Black people have a slightly higher saving rate than white people when you control for income. And that's against our conventional wisdom. And when we see it, we come up with all types of alternative explanations to try to explain it. People say, well, Black people are constrained in capital markets to borrow. That becomes the explanation. That may be true, but it also may be true that it's not only also may be true, it is true that the source of inequality is not ingrained in Black people's behavior. I'll put a button on it and make the last point. Even when we look at education, the point that I raised earlier, Black people are overrepresented in graduate education. Again, despite the fact that they get a lower economic return and marketplace for that education. And they very well may be overeducated because if you know you're going to get discriminated against, you may work twice as hard to overcome those barriers. So baby bonds. Baby bonds is an example of a policy that's intended to recognize that power is essential, capital is essential in order for people to have economic agency and to get into an asset that's going to passively appreciate over their life. So I think it's similar to some of the policies that we've seen in the past, a rights framework, a birthright to capital, so that just being born, regardless of your race, when you become a young adult, you'll be able to put that money that's reserved for you by the state into a down payment of a home, into a debt-free education, into some capital to start a business. What's the difference between a homeowner and a renter? A down payment. What's the difference between an entrepreneur and a worker? Oftentimes capital. If you're a worker, however good your idea is, you can't bring it to market without some capital. And one more thing, I'm sorry. It's anti-racist and anti-sexist because of our lived history. And what makes it anti-sexist? Even within families, we know that parents make decisions about bequest and inheritance in gendered ways. So this would be combating the built-up patriarchy that we have by assuring that even if you're, woman or boy or girl, you have some capital set aside for you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go to another question from the audience, and I'm reading here. We recently saw that in the pandemic, the vast majority of population and minorities all over the world have experienced extreme income decreases and unemployment at the same time that some oligarchs have seen their wealth increase by more than 200%. Do you think that inequalities, exploitation, racism, and sexism can be eliminated under a neoliberal capitalistic system as one that exists today, that has profit as its gospel? And how can we democratize the economic sphere of our society in order to eliminate all those inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, the quick short answer is no. As long as we have a firm-centric industrial policy aimed at notions that if only we offer resources directed at firms in a concentrated way, that it's going to trickle down to all of us, and by mere effort, we're able to have social mobility. That understanding is wrongheaded because it ignores power and capital by which individuals need in order to have agency at the outset. And what's more, that ideology has been fueled by racism. That ideology of who's deserving and undeserving, of the market being a sanction for good and bad behavior is racialized. That is the point. So when we look at a poor person, we're able to explain their poverty, their situation, because of something innately wrong with them, or worse, or not worse, or some lack of motivation. And then we come up with solutions where the market is intended to be a regulator, a solution. What I'm proposing and what others have proposed is an economic rights frame where the public allows people to have some resources so that they can adequately compete. Basically, what we're proposing is a counterframe that, rather than disciplining poor people, disciplines employers. Imagine if we had a federal job guarantee that said, here are the prevailing wages, the prevailing benefits, and the prevailing working conditions. And we're going to guarantee it to all our workers, not just on any job, but a productive job, a job where the private sector is not adequately producing anyway. We have all this demand for care in our economy, and it's not sufficiently being produced. We have climate catastrophes looming. We have a need to green our economy, and we're not adequately producing it. We could probably take a walk in our daily lives and think about all the public goods that we need that aren't being adequately produced. Imagine putting the full workforce of Americans towards producing this economy that we would desire. We can even go beyond the US borders and think about what was the best American foreign policy in our history. In my view, it was, I'm trying to, it's terrible, I forgot the name of it. It was the policy that rebuilt Europe after World War II. What was it? What was the name of that policy? Help me, Janice, I'm forgetting the name of it.
Marshall Plan?
The Marshall Plan, I appreciate that. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe kept us out of World War III. You know, what was that issue was that it was directed only at Europe and not the rest of the world. But imagine a new Marshall Plan where we put the world to work towards developing infrastructure that can promote peace, that can adjust the flow of migrants across borders and make us all more resilient. This is what I'm talking about. If we had an industrial policy that put people first, not only would it directly benefit people, it would reduce the lure of a despotic appeal to relative status. In other words, if all Americans were better resourced, we would be less susceptible to fascism. If we had a potent policy alternative that did not leave us vulnerable to a desire to be better than someone else, that would be a way to promote shared prosperity in and of itself. And if we thought about building up a collective infrastructure, public infrastructure, as well as policies that discipline employers, that discipline employers in a way that says, if you want to compete for American workers, you have to offer at least this. You cannot exploit our workers because it's a treasured value resource that we as a country are investing in. This does not do away with corporations. They will still exist, but it will require them to not be exploitive, that will not be extractive, because Americans will have viable public alternatives to turn to otherwise. And then, I'm sorry, one last thing I'll say is, not only does this benefit workers directly, but we have a history in which this built up infrastructure also facilitates growth in corporations. If corporations had workers that could come to work less concerned about caring for an ailing grandmother, a child, they could be more productive in the workplace. If we could get off the ledgers of corporations' health insurance, how more competitive would they be in the international landscape?
Okay, thank you. That question was submitted by Dimitrios Koukaios. So now I'd like to put two questions together that follow up a little bit more on the baby bonds. One submitted by El Kayafa Roland and Professor Darryl McLeod. In terms of baby bonds, a question asks, What about a wealth tax, perhaps, to finance the baby bonds or the sort of jobs program that you mentioned? Roughly, how large would the US baby bond be? And there is an interest in, can you refer us to an article on this topic?
Yeah, so I guess a trifecta to deal with our wealth scenarios around race and overall concentration would one be reparations, which is a retrospective approach that not only would be direct and parsimonious in addressing the racial wealth gap, but also would have that truth and reconciliation component to affect political narratives, to affect the ways in which we understand and define poverty, period. Because if we have that authentic analysis, then it would provide greater ammunition to root out arguments that poverty is grounded in deficiencies within people, as opposed to poverty being grounded within resources in general. The ways in which we have racialized poverty extend well beyond Black people. We characterize white people as being deficient. When we talk about white poverty, I'll use a bad word, I apologize beforehand. We niggerize white poverty. We ground it in detrimental terms around behaviors and attitudes that are deficiencies, a deficiency frame. So reparations would have that added effect and also would be a cleansing for our nation so that we could have a new system that's more moral, where we're not grounded in that original sin of slavery that's well embedded in our Constitution. But that's not enough. It's not enough because what do we know about capital? It iterates, it concentrates, and it excludes. So we need something that's not just a one-time retrospective policy. We need something that addresses consolidated capital in perpetuity. Baby bonds is not a one-time policy. It is aimed at ensuring that every American has some resource reserved to them so that they can have the most critical asset to promote their well-being, and that is wealth. So, the question of how much it would be progressively seeded depending on the wealth position to which you're born and you grow. So the nominal account for baby bonds would be about 500 or 1,000 to make it a policy that's akin to a stakeholder society. In other words, we're all in it together, so everybody would get some endowment. The average account could be about 25,000, and to those born into the most wealth-poor families, they can get upwards to $50,000. And why such a large endowment? Because we need an endowment large enough to put people into an asset that will passively grow over their lifetime. In other words, you need a down payment for a home, and $1,000 ain't going to get it, for example. Then the wealth tax. Let me get to that portion. And this is why it's a trifecta policy. I think our monetary system has the capability of funding and financing America's most treasured asset, and that is its people. So this whole notion of deficits, I think we need to reconceive of it when we think about investments in people. That's one point. This pandemic has demonstrated our capacity to generate large sums of money and distribute them in a quick way, in a way that's not going to tank our economy. That Trump tax cut of $2 trillion over a decade, that's not going to tank our economy. It's going to grow our deficit. It's going to lead to greater despair and inequality, but it actually will have a stimulus effect. It's not the best stimulus effect because we could take those resources and invest them in a better way that promotes shared prosperity. But my point is that our concerns with deficits have been overstated. They matter. Inflation could be a concern, but not if we're investing in productive resources in the ways that I've been describing, at least in this period of time. But we do need a wealth tax. We need a wealth tax, in my view, because of that concentration of wealth that I described in the beginning, where the top 0.1% of the population holds more of the nation's wealth than the bottom 90% altogether. That is anti-democratic. That is dysfunctional. that leads to a mechanism of defining our political economy that's antithetical to promoting shared prosperity. We need to recognize that politics, economics, and social stratification cannot be neatly separated. They are intertwined, and hence we need a wealth tax, not necessarily to pay for things, although it does have the added value of being able to finance other projects and direct our budgets in a more moral way, in a way that reflective of what our social values may be. But we need it in large part because we have plutocracy without it.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hamilton. I have a few questions I'm going to put together here that follow up and ask just a bit more detail. Some of the questions are from anonymous attendees, but I'm trying here from Juliet Pola and also Maya Murray. What about this? Some of your ideas seem to move towards solving racial wealth inequality, but also assist whites along the way. Do you prefer that to an explicitly racially or descendant of slavery type policy? And would you comment on universal basic income? How would this compare to, let's say, the baby bond situation? Do you see any comparability here in how that type of transfer would also be a viable option to address inequality?
So let me be clear that there is no silver bullet policy, that we have multiple dimensions of economic insecurity, and it's going to require a package of goods, which is why I'm talking about an economic rights framework and an anti-racist economic rights framework, an anti-sexist economic rights framework, because history has shown us that if we're not intentional in our design and in our implementation, it will effectively be racist or sexist. In fact, history has shown us that even in our economic rights framework, we have been intentionally racist and sexist in design and implementation. Hence, we need anti-racist and anti-sexist. But economic rights means what it means, an economic right regardless of race and gender. But let me get to the question of reparations. We need reparations. We need reparations for a variety of reasons. Again, it is direct, it is parsimonious, but that truth and reconciliation is important as well. And without it, we won't ever cleanse our soul or create pathways for new narratives that are grounded in the truth of resource deprivations for the reasons I've named earlier. But reparations alone won't be enough either, because as I mentioned, the way our economy works is without government intervention, capital and political power will do what they do best. They will consolidate and they will leave some out and benefit some at the expense of others. And race and gender and other forms of social identity become useful strategic tools to fuel that concentration. So that's the framework that I'm offering. So I guess when I talk about economic rights, the one that I talk about that is explicitly race-based is reparations. The other ones are universal, but again, by design and implementation, thought of in an active way to ensure that everybody's included.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think this will be the last question, and this is from a student, Shania Diaz, and she asks, do you think the wealth tax might anger the top 1% of the people having this wealth, which can negatively affect the economy in a case where this population has major investments and firms that employ a large number of workers? Does this negatively impact the worker involved in this situation despite their race or gender?
Yeah. So will they be upset? Yes, they'll be upset. Power won't concede easy. Should we do it anyway? Yes, we should do it anyway. I want to take. I forgot to talk about UBI too. I can go back to that, but I'll take. The question is a serious one, and we should address it, which is what will be the ramifications and backlash if we engage in this type of policy and those that have all this power decide to exert their power in a different way. Well, however much power they have, they do not have more power than we as people, we as a democracy, and frankly, the federal government itself. There's no firm that has, and indeed, it is the federal government that facilitates their wealth in the first place. It is, if we think about procurement, the amount of goods and services that the federal government is already involved in terms of purchasing and helping to produce, it's dramatic. I'm sure somebody has produced the figures of the amount of engagement in our economy. I don't know it off the top of my head, but this notion that capital will have a backlash, they will attempt to use their political power and might to not have this type of system. But I dare say we have more power, and that without it, the status quo of growing inequality is unsustainable in the first place. I mean, let me answer the UBI question, and I'll try to say something else provocative and end. I know we're running out of time, and I was told this is the last question. So with regards to UBI, I'm in full favor of guaranteed income. And I believe that the tax code could be a way in which we could implement guaranteed income. We already have a framework of the earned income tax credit, which is basically a negative income tax. But we make a political decision to not extend earned income tax credit to those people that aren't working. Well, that's a choice. We can make a different political choice and provide a basic income to everybody, regardless of work, and still have the earned income tax credit structure. Basically, shift the shift earned income tax credit upwards up to a level that could literally eliminate poverty with a subsidy going to poor people in a way that doesn't disincentivize work. And on the back end, we could extend the phase out further than the working poverty all the way up to the middle class if we so choose. So, with full throat, I'm in favor of guaranteed income. And I don't think I see it as a complement to a federal job guarantee. And I could talk more about it if I had more time, but I know we're winding out on time. But I'm not in favor of universal basic income for a variety of reasons. One, it's an inefficient way to distribute cash to people because it does it in a diluted way. If you literally gave everybody the same income across the economy, that's almost the definition of inflation. And it reduces the buying power of those that need it most on the lower end. So it's the universal part of basic income that I'm opposed to. Also, it is inequality enhancing because by definition, if you're poor, you will consume that income because you're a subsistence population. But if you're wealthy, effectively, you're getting a subsidy to your investment because your consumption needs are already met. And that will lead to a greater wealth disparity. And then finally, a lot of times the UBI is framed in the end of work, that the robots will replace us and work will go away. So it's grounded in some utopia where we have service tech firms that are producing some products and the rest of us are and I know I'm exaggerating and using hyperbole, but I'm trying to make the point. Work is not going to go away and work will evolve and change. And it's a fundamental desire of the human condition to engage in productive activities in social settings. And we need a government to help facilitate that and facilitate it at a livable wage. So the final thing I'll say to end on, this system of neoliberalism very well may be on the ropes. And what might indicate that? look at the political infighting that's going on within parties. The Republican Party is in disarray. It's not grounded in some ideology, as we see in the ways that has been governed in the last couple of election cycles. The Democratic Party is fighting also with a centrist middle, fighting against a growing progressive arm that's pushing for an economic rights frame. And the American people seem to be questing and desiring something different, especially young people. So I ended my talk talking about is change on the horizons? Do young people demand something different? I believe they do. I believe that my generation got seduced by Reaganomics and Thatcherism, where we thought that only if we went to the Ivy League schools, only if we invested in ourselves, we would be fine. And it was those other knuckleheads that needed to pull their pants up in order to have social mobility. That led to an individualistic identity, away from collective bargaining, away from collective efficacy. Younger people today seem to be arguing for justice in no uncertain terms. They are demanding gender rights, racial rights, the end of climate change in a way that's giving me optimism. This confluence of activity suggests to me that we have this Overton moment to come up with a new economic paradigm. A new economic paradigm, again, that puts morality, that puts human flourishing and dignity up front in a sustainable way.
Thank you so very much, Professor Hamilton, for your vision, for your optimism, and for your work, which we all hope to build on and ponder as we leave this wonderful lecture. So thank you for visiting Fordham University, and thank you to all of the attendees. Goodbye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.